Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our second special episode of Making Hazing History with Mike and Hank. I am your host, Mike Eilon, CEO of Greek University. Our co-host today, of course, is none other than Hank Nuwer, the author of Hazing, Destroying Young Lives, Wrongs of Passage, High School Hazing, and The Hazing Reader. He's also retiring, a longtime Alpha Lambda Delta chapter advisor at Franklin College, which I think lends into some of the conversation that we're going to be having here today. Today, we're going to be talking about first-year hazing that has taken to a dangerous extreme. And we call this particular episode Tackling the Unsolved Mystery of Henrietta Jackson's Death. As we discuss hazing here, this particular story, I think, is very important from a legal standpoint. So we'll get to that a little bit later in the interview. But first off, welcome to the show, Hank.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you back as always. I'm starting to get used to this weekly interviews and just doing a little bit more in terms of knowledge on hazing and really kind of this all-encompassing look at it. My focus has always been, of course, on fraternity and sorority. You have a much wider lens, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that you bring that to our listeners. And today, let's talk to our listeners a little bit about this concept of class hazing. What is class hazing?
Okay. Well, this is the kind of hazing that started from the very beginning at Harvard College. It was brought across from England, which had fagging practices, which was basically where an upperclassman had a younger student in a very servile position, almost like a servant for about a year. And then, of course, it changes and the servant becomes the master to the next person coming in. It was brutal, cruel, and very severe and should have been stopped. And it was at the most prestigious schools in England at that time. So it was brought here by scholars to America. And as early as a year or two after the founding of Harvard, Joseph Webb was fined for hazing and was suspended. So it goes back all the way. And these are the roots, along with hazing in Masonic societies, that got into American fraternities as well.
Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah, I'm familiar with that Joseph Webb case. That's something I talk about when I talk to the students about hazing, and we talk about some of the origins there. When I was at school at the University of Buffalo, of course, I didn't see any kind of class hazing at all. Was freshman hazing still a reality when you were a first-year student at Buffalo State?
Yes, this is 1964, and it was sanctioned by the school, which was a very good school. We had to wear orange and black beanies, just like Martin Luther made his students wear at Wittenberg many, many years earlier. So this actually went all the way to just a few years ago at Elmira College, which was still having students wear these beanies. That, of course, wasn't the worst part. The worst part really for a lot of students was you just had to drop and give people 20, 40, 50 sit-ups whenever they would demand, or push-ups. And so it was kind of physical that way. You had to address everyone as sir, and you couldn't tell a sophomore, but they could always tell a freshman. And I think the worst one I got was a nice guy later I found out named Steve Ash, but you never forget these things, who had me drop 50 because I stuffed my cap into my back pocket so no one would recognize me. But he did. And I was, quote unquote, punished on the spot.
Wow, this is so interesting. Did people actually die from this type of class hazing that you're talking about?
Yes, and what's little known is that prior to about 1928, class hazing was the predominant cause of deaths from hazing in American educational institutions, not fraternities. After 1928, that started shifting. This is what gives me hope, though, that we can end deaths in fraternities. Since that 1928 period, when it was attacked by a lot of students, there was a big student movement against it. There was only one more death at Cheney State afterwards. And one death is too many. but imagine if we could do that with fraternities. So there was a big movement against hazing in the 20s, but not in fraternities, against this class hazing that had taken so many lives.
That certainly gives us hope within the fraternity and sorority community. Can you give us some examples of tragedies that have happened in terms of class hazing?
Sure. I think first we should talk about what they had. The terms vary, of course, as always happens with hazing. You have battle royals. That would be one where the freshmen and the sophomores would meet. You'd have people fighting for flags. You'd have the class flag fighting for the last one. You'd have a brawl at Purdue under the water tower, which did lead to the death of Francis Obenshine, who died in a pileup. And this was tied to the brutality of American football, especially after the 1900s. As you probably know from your reading, Theodore Roosevelt considered even banning American football. And this physical encounters was thought to build manhood. It was interesting in terms of gender studies or masculinity. And so these class hazings paralleled the terrible battles that we saw in football that led to so many deaths. So on to a couple of examples I have here. 1838, we have John Butler Groves, who died in a hazing incident. That was at Franklin Seminary in Kentucky. To give you an idea of the scope of tragedies, 1919, Colgate University in New York had a class hazing in which Frank McCullough, a freshman, was abandoned on an island. Nobody came for him. Finally, out of frustration, he tried to swim and perished. We have University of Pennsylvania, a freshman, sophomore battle royal, in which we had a student, first-year student, William Lifson, smother in the pileup with so many students on top. This gives you an idea of how educators viewed it at the time. Provost Smith, incredibly, said that Lifson died, quote unquote, in honor with his hand on the bowl that they were fighting for. And so this, while fraternity hazing has always been disputed and fought, class hazing was supported as a way to build school spirit and to teach manhood and to teach life's lessons for so many years.
Wow, this is so interesting to me. Was this something that was punished by either the university or the authorities or anybody?
It was punished by authorities. We did have a lot of suspensions, had some expulsions, usually with the student coming back some years later. But you have to understand, when there was an expulsion, the entire classes, sometimes with a band, would walk the student to the train station to get on, because that person was considered a sort of hero to the rest of the group. But very, very few cases where there was legislation, or very few cases in which there was criminal punishments. And so I know that your viewers would like to know that 1912, freshman Isaac Rand was asked to dance, and apparently alcohol was involved, but not for Isaac, but for the participants, on a barrel. When he danced on the barrel, he fell off, hit a bottle, and slit his throat open.
Oh my God.
There was panic. They tried to get help. This is at the University of North Carolina. They tried to get help for Rand, but it was too late, and he died very, very quickly. The governor of North Carolina went after President Venable and asked him how he could permit these kinds of things. So North Carolina tightened up. And then the other thing was interesting is that they were sentenced on manslaughter charges, but the courts took mercy on the perpetrators and had them serve their arrests at home under the observation of their parents. But I think that was interesting. So that was 1912. We did have some form of punishment, but mostly the attitude, boys will be boys. We're going to lose a few along the way. This is something that I think we need to look at in terms of education's responsibility to the fact that we have hazing today.
Yeah, I agree with you there. In your book, Hazing, Destroying Young Lives, you wrote about a case involving a bystander in a freshman hazing. Tell us more about that.
Okay, this would be a quote unquote unsolved crime, which I think I have solved in the book Hazing, Destroying Young Lives. The chapter is called Dead to Rights. And what happened there is we had freshmen and sophomores trying to destroy each other's class parties. Now, these were co-ed events, and the class of 1897 was celebrating. The class of 1896 was trying to break up the party, and this occurred in 1894. So we're looking at a timeline. The banquets were big affairs with red and white banners, the entire class attending, lots of toasting, a lot of speeches, a lot of predictions for great things to come. The sophomores, a few of them, it looked like 5 to 7 that I could find, decided to pump pure chlorine into the banquet hall to try to disrupt proceedings. Very, very dangerous, very, very unthought at. What they were thinking, who knows? And had they been successful in getting it into the banquet room, would have killed probably 50 or 60 people in a mad dash to the doors. Okay, what did happen? They miscalculated. The chlorine went into the kitchen, sickening African-American and student workers who were in the kitchen, and leading to Mrs. Henrietta Jackson suffocating, being led outside to a doctor who was very close by, and died in the chair in minutes out of suffocation. This was interesting. Newspapers at the time misidentified her, this African-American woman. They named her daughter incorrectly. They blamed her for her demise, saying she was probably in terrible, terrible shape. All of this took the onus away from the perpetrators. And so to kind of shorten the story a little bit, it finally did get some outrage in the state of New York and the United States. In fact, it got a lot of outrage because the New York Sun and other newspapers really played it up. Newspapers in Buffalo, New York played it up. Why? One of the perpetrators who vanished was Carl Dingens. His father was one of the wealthiest people in New York State in Buffalo. He was a coffee purveyor. He also sold fine brandies all over the country and was the developer of one of the first successful cookbooks that went everywhere in the United States. A man of means. His son disappeared. He got the best lawyer he could, who was actually Mark Twain's lawyer, and would later run for office for governor in the state of New York. And that's why you mentioned before this case being legally important. He argued, Mr. Stanfield, who was the attorney, that the perpetrators would not have to testify against each other or themselves. This drove a presiding judge crazy, Judge Forbes, who insisted that they do tell. Mr. Stanfield held out, and it became in the 19th century one of the most important cases in terms of someone's right to not testify against himself in a court case. Long and the short of it, they could not prove who was actually up there putting the chlorine in. They knew who was involved in some way. But to this day, I don't know for sure if Carl Dingens was the person upstairs who pumped the chlorine in or one of the other perpetrators. That was the case. So this case of this African-American cook, to me, could have been solved if I was able to find the paraphernalia that went up there. Unfortunately, the evidence has been destroyed over time, because had I been able to come up with that, and I really tried, going to the courthouse and other places, we could have solved the mystery of the death of Henrietta Jackson.
Wow, that's so interesting. I know Mark Twain was a big objector to hazing at that time, so it's so interesting to see the connection there. Why don't you read a paragraph or two for us, Hank? Let's learn some more.
Okay. So now imagine the perpetrator upstairs thinking he's dropping gas into the banquet hall, but instead it's going into the kitchen. A little after 11 p.m., the perpetrator connected rubber and glass tubes to two empty dark-colored jars that once had stored soda fountain syrup. And Mike, I know that you're interested in great foods. In Ithaca, just a year or two earlier, the sundae was invented. The ice cream, the chocolate syrup, what else? Butterscotch syrup, sundaes. So that's what was used for the murder weapon.
Wow.
Okay. The jars contain chlorine made with commercial potash and other ingredients found at any mercantile store. He pumped the chlorine into the room above. Confused shouts erupted when the vapors spread. The raider, assuming the chaos signified choking freshmen, escaped through a window, knocking puffs of snow off the sill. So little snow was knocked off, according to an investigating Ithaca police officer, that it was likely one person had committed the act. Light snow coated the alley ground. He obliterated his footprints with or without the help of conspirators and bolted like a thief in the night. However, the amateur criminal left behind paraphernalia that served as evidence. The potash package, purchased from a local merchant, bore the store's name handwritten in ink. The perpetrator also had abandoned a shipping box from a New York merchant labeled with the address of 6 Cook Street, likely the perpetrator's own boarding house. If the prankster had removed the labels, he would have left no clues at all. So this case is important. If if Carl Dingens were made to testify against himself, he would have had a homicide charge against him, a very serious one.
Wow.
So this was an important case.
Yeah, that is an incredible account that you've just gone through. I mean, unbelievable. In terms of your research, when was the last death connected to class hazing?
Okay, that would be a Cheney State, and that one, a young man jumped on the back of a freshman and slammed him into a wall. The person had a head injury and died. So Cheney State was the very last one. We've had some hazing incidents, and I mentioned my own, and there were things in the 60s like kangaroo courts where you would get trials and so on. But the most dangerous, the class hazings, the battle royals, all that ended.
Yeah, this has been really helpful, I know, for me, because I've spent so much time in fraternity and sorority hazing that you almost lose sight of everything else that is happening before that, around that, whether it be athletics or this class hazing that you're talking about. Certainly, there are many instances in the military, and you know, you can go on and on and on. But I think this is helpful to frame it up that this is really a phenomenon that's happening in all areas and all sectors of life. It's obviously not constrained just to fraternity and sorority.
Yeah, and the new book that I'm doing is called Hazing in American Culture. And it's everything from the hazing of the Basques and the Chinese in the West to today. I found a railroad initiation in which a railroad worker was killed. I have many examples of occupational hazing. I'm really getting now into nurse hazing and doctor hazing. It's going to be an incredible book in terms of shedding light, I think, on hazing in the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned the gangs and the bikers as well. I mean,
Oh,
unbelievable.
gross, grim, yes, really, really disgusting stuff and
Wow.
dangerous.
Mhm. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time, Hank. This has been really helpful for me, and I think also for our audience as well, to give a little bit of perspective to hazing. Don't miss the next episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about the deaths of athletes in fraternity, club, and team hazing, which is another very important aspect that we want to take a look at. So, thank you so much to our listeners for listening today. Please feel free to forward this to others that you think might be interested in some of this information as it relates to hazing. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Hank.
Thanks. And I had one small suggestion. If any viewers out there would like to know about a particular case in history, please let Mike know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty to choose from, unfortunately, but we'd be glad to take a deeper dive into that. Hank has access to a lot of records and newspapers and other information that we can do a deep dive into particular cases. So definitely, please let me know. My email address is bookings@greekuniversity.org. Feel free to shoot me an email with a particular case. Hank and I can do a deep dive for you on one of the next episodes coming up here soon. And we'd love to discuss that a little bit further. So thank you so much, Hank. Thank you so much to our listeners. And we'll see you on another episode sometime soon. Take care.